Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, looking at the stories by which we deeply live. How often have you seen change, real lasting change, come about through procedures, committees, rules, organizational stuff, formal organizational stuff? How often have you seen that bring about change? I can think of a few examples, but usually it has just the opposite effect. Usually the formal meetings, the formal procedures do nothing except reinforce the status quo. I recently tried to convince a fairly large school to create a public program specialization in eco-psychology and eco-spirituality, and the idea was killed in a meeting. I've seen this a lot. I've been in academia for 20 years, and it more often goes that way than not. And when people on a board or in a meeting or on a committee do approve something, it's usually because it supports something that already exists. For instance, to pick a different industry as an example, when you try to sell your writing to a publisher, something that all publishers and agents pretty much all tell you up front is, this can't be too different from what we already publish. And what's even more fun is when you're dealing with an organization, business, government, religious, whatever it is, educational, and you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to follow the procedures, and one set of procedures tells you to do it one way, and another tells you to do it in exactly the opposite way. They completely contradict each other, and no one can be found to make a decision about which one is right. By contrast, in 1901, President Teddy Roosevelt was doing some reading about the national park system. For instance, Yellowstone had become a national park. And he reached out to prominent naturalist John Muir. And he said, I want to go camping with you at Yosemite, which was not among the protected parks. And Roosevelt said, quote, I do not want anyone with me but you. And I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you. So by 1903, they made that happen. And Roosevelt and Muir camped out in Yosemite among those beautiful trees, in the snow, among the mountains. And Muir functioned as the president's unofficial guide. And so Roosevelt was so changed by that trip, and he had been outdoors bunches of times. He was an outdoorsman. But there was something about that trip that really got to him. And so by 1906, he signed a federal law to make Yosemite and Mariposa Grove part of Yosemite National Park, which was something that Muir had been campaigning for quite some time. And then Roosevelt also signed into existence 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 bird sanctuaries, and wildlife refuges, and 150 national forests. So there's an example of when informality and relationship make change. When I was training to be a family therapist, I came across a similar strategy in the work of Mara Salvini Palazzoli, who was one of the founders of an Italian style of doing family therapy, and she was also a corporate consultant. And a piece of advice she gave was, when you're trying to resolve some kind of entrenched difficulty, the first thing to do is to bring people together informally and have them carry out a task that, at least on the surface, is unrelated to what the issue is, the difficult issue, and make sure they don't talk about it. The idea being that they need to get past all the objectifying and labeling and biases and bad history and all the other things that obscure their view of each other so that they can encounter each other as human beings and actually form relationships. Then you work out the difficult stuff, which at that point will be a lot easier to work on. This was echoed in some late work done by Carl Rogers. He was talking to his daughter, Natalie Rogers, also a psychologist, at one point late in his career, and she asked him, "Why do you never take on politics? All your encounter group work has been with individuals in more or less therapeutic settings, but this stuff should be used outside the consulting room." So he invited members of different governments and nations in conflict, some from the Middle East, some from other places, representatives, and he did groups with them for a number of weeks. And he was so successful with this that a couple of things happened. One was his book, Carl Rogers on Personal Power, which I recommend, even though I don't think the title really does the work of the book justice. It's not a good title for the book. Probably an editor's choice, and or publishers. And then the second thing that came out of it was, in some cases, the people in his groups were representatives of countries that were so locked in conflict that the group members had to keep secret the fact that they had become friends in the groups. Here's a much smaller example from my own experience. When I was at John F. Kennedy University, with a great deal of help, especially from my department chair, I launched the world's first ecotherapy certificate. But I did it against a lot of opposition at first. And our program kept being blocked, particularly by the clinical people, the psychotherapy instruction people, who didn't like that we were doing something involving healing and had some fears about it, some of which they weren't being upfront about in the official meetings. So I arranged to meet with some of them informally in different settings, some of them outside. And I asked them frankly, "What's your real concern about this program?" And some of them said, "Well, that word therapy, I mean, it's we don't want people doing therapy without a license," which I think is a good concern to have. I shared it. And so when we actually launched the certificate, we had everybody sign off on a form that said, "I understand that this is in no way a licensing program, and it doesn't authorize me to see people in psychotherapy." But I also pointed out to the people with this concern that their profession didn't own the word therapy, and that there were massage therapists and sound healing therapists and bunches of other kinds. So why not ecotherapists too? And I think it was the informal conversations that turned the tide. Nothing that happened in the official meetings. Relationships, personal ones, also make a huge difference at the beginning of big movements, and so much of a difference that one could actually say that the movement is founded on them. So think about Christianity, and this is true of other religions too. At the very beginning, no official church, no hierarchy, no any of that. Just some interested people meeting in each other's homes. That's how it started. The civil rights movement, informal meetings in homes, in churches, at work. At the beginning of the American Revolution, people on fast horses would ride out to distant taverns, town centers, gathering places under trees, and they would dispense the latest news to eager ears, waiting for a chance to swing into action. I wonder how many hugely significant historical shifts, decisions, events came about because somebody had exactly the right conversation with their hairdresser or with a friend or with a coworker, somebody they met at a grocery store. Especially in times of stress and transition, I suspect that getting together informally is part of the human blueprint. We see it in all cultures, we see it in all times, all kinds of societies. And where things fall apart on a massive scale seems always to be associated with impersonality, bureaucracy, hierarchy. In 1994, I was living in Calabasas, California, and the Northridge earthquake hit. It was a powerful earthquake that actually knocked houses off their foundations. I was close enough to the epicenter that the apartment complex I was living in took some damage, and nothing actually collapsed, but pretty much everything fragile in my apartment was destroyed. Same with a lot of other people. Power was out. No emergency response for a couple of days. And not that long after the quake, neighbors started to gather in the courtyard. And in many cases, these were people, including me, who had never met one another. We lived next door to each other and occasionally said a polite hello, but we didn't know who each other were. And so we swapped stories a little bit as a kind of natural way to get to know each other, just informally. And then somebody said, I'm an engineer and I should really go around and inspect this apartment complex to see if it's safe for us to keep staying here. Since the phone lines are down, the authorities, who knows what they're doing. So we all thought that was a good idea. And somebody else said, there's a good chance that the grocery store up the road, if it's not empty now, it probably will be soon. And since our power's out and we have a really big grill, what if we start grilling stuff up, grilling some food for all of us? And just have a big party. And we all thought that was a great idea. And somebody else a plumber went around looking at people's pipes, and I had some experience in crisis counseling, so I went around and talked to people and held their hands and helped them calm down, and we all just chipped in. And I think that's who we really are as human beings. I think that's what we do. By contrast, there's a meme going around on social media that said that we're going to be the first species to lose our planet because it didn't make business sense to save it. So we're at our worst when we can hide behind roles and bureaucracies and procedures and hierarchies and all that business as usual stuff. And again, there is a place for business as usual. During ordinary times, it can function pretty well, but not during times of massive transition or times when change needs to happen. Then it tends to function poorly. A while back, I did a TikTok video on the topic of dealing effectively with frustrations caused by bureaucracies. And one of the things I mentioned was bringing your humanity to the situation. And so, as an example of that, what I'll often do when, for instance, I'm having to call a large organization of some kind, media provider or government or whatever, and I'm just not getting anywhere. A lot of times, what I will then do is ask the other person, if you were in my situation, how would you deal with this? And then say a little bit about what the situation actually is and what I've tried. And I found that most of the time, they respond in a very human way. And, not so much the the trained response of, oh yeah, that must be very frustrating for you, and the stuff that people are taught to say nowadays. But they get real too a lot of the times, and say they'll offer something off the table formally. They'll put it back on by saying, let me ask around a little bit on this end. What's your number, and I'll call you back. And so they start becoming more responsible too, instead of hiding behind a role or a title or the organization itself. I think it would be really interesting to do a social science study on how well communities and organizations that don't make space for informal kinds of meetings and relationships actually do in terms of weathering conflict, transition, and change. I think that would be a great study. When I go somewhere and there are no rooms for people to meet in informally, no spaces set aside for them, no parks, no gathering places of any kind, no sidewalks to walk on, I really wonder how well such a place can weather adversity. And so, of course, there's a lot of research on how being outside in scenic places is good for us, but I think it's also good for our relationships, our resilience, our capacity for making change. Now, at this point, some will say, well, this is why we need revolutions. Whether at the organizational level or neighborhood or nation or what have you. And the problem with revolutions is they tend to perpetuate what they fight against. So what I'd like to see more of is organizations that are modified through informal relationship building to deal with change. So it starts with the relationships and it modifies the procedures and roles and hierarchies. And then there's a sense of continuity. Clearly hugely pathological organizations that are basically like Saturn eating his own children aren't going to do that. But organizations that are more on the hardy side or innovative side, I think they're capable of it. Especially during times of huge political polarization and division, which is happening in my country right now. Even more urgent becomes the need for us to have places to talk to each other just as people. And it's so necessary for there to be opportunities to disassemble our biases, our prejudices, our fixed ideas about our neighbor, our coworker, or entire groups of people. Those liberals, those conservatives, always those people over there. So necessary to have spaces where we just put all that aside and meet each other as human beings, members of the great human family. To paraphrase and expand a bit on a point that Carl Sagan made some time back, if extraterrestrials were to visit today and have a look at us, the first thing they would not do is point somebody out and say, that one's a Buddhist, and that one over there is a Christian. That one here is a Democrat, and this one's a Republican. What they would overwhelmingly notice is that we were members of the same species, the same family. And so, without ignoring important differences or the problems between us and within us, of course, maybe we can do a little bit of enchantivism and come up with some stories and some images, some art and some song about when we find each other as human beings, outside the halls, outside the boardrooms, the classrooms, all of that, out in some open field where we recognize each other. And although we may disagree heartily and continue to do so, we at least have relationships with each other to fall back on, so that when the argumentation is temporarily suspended or over, we can say, and how are your kids doing? How's your health? That problem at home you were having, whatever happened with that? And in this way, perhaps we can recognize in the eyes of other people, in their stories, something of ourselves as well. Thank you.